thank you very much for coming, especially because I understand we're actually competing with Kofi Annan. And I'm glad you prefer a current author over an outgoing UN Secretary General. I just want to be very brief and thank some people. In addition to our national sponsors, well, first of all, our national sponsors. Our national sponsors are KLM Royal Dutch Airlines and the Dutch Literary Production and Translation Fund. And together with the Netherlands America Foundation, who I represent here tonight, those are the sponsors who made it possible for Mr. Muck to give this lecture and to give a series of lectures throughout the United States in the next couple of weeks. All around the topic of Dutch disease or European dilemma, Calvinist legacies confront globalization and Islam. The Netherlands America Foundation is the premier organization here in the United States to further strengthen the bonds of friendship and cooperation between the United States and the Netherlands. We do that through all kinds of exchanges and sponsorship of events. For example, we also sponsor many of the Fulbright scholars who come to the United States or American Fulbright scholars who go to the Netherlands. And an event like this fits exactly in the kind of things we would like to do. Here in DC, we've always been active to some extent, and we're planning to become more active with more local activities to achieve our general objective. So you'll hear more from us. And if you would like to hear more from us, what I would ask you to do after this event is to go to the back there while we're having our reception or when you're leaving and leave us the business card or write down your email address so we can contact you for future events. Finally, I would like to thank some of our local sponsors. The Netherlands Embassy has been kind enough to provide funding for our reception afterwards, to which you're all invited and which will take place behind you here. I would also like to thank the Berkeley Center here at Georgetown and the BMW Center here at Georgetown, both of whom are hosting this event and who made it possible for us to be in this beautiful location. I'll give the floor to Tom Benshoff of the Berkeley Center, who will introduce Mr. Muck, and I hope you'll enjoy tonight's lecture.
Good afternoon, good evening. It's wonderful to see such a great crowd here for this great event. Thank you, Naboth, for the kind introduction. It really is a pleasure and an honor for us here at Georgetown to be able to host the inaugural lecture in this NAF-sponsored series with Gerd Mock. As Naboth mentioned, the sponsors of the event here on campus are the BMW Center, which is the BMW Center for German and European Studies, and its director, Jeff Anderson, and the Berkeley Center, not to be confused with Berkeley, University of California, but the Berkeley Center here at Georgetown, a new enterprise which I direct, which is part of a university-wide effort here at Georgetown to look at the role of religion in international affairs and world affairs from multiple cross-disciplinary perspectives. I think today you'll agree we have a topic which fits perfectly with the mission of both our centers, which brings in Dutch and European politics and relates them to questions of religion and world affairs. A topic not just of intellectual interest, but of policy interest here in Washington and around the world. Most of you know Gerd Mock, of course, as an acclaimed writer. He also has an academic background in sociology and law and has taught at the University of Amsterdam. But as I suggested, he's most known to you as one of the Netherlands' best-selling and most critically acclaimed writers. Someone who works in the nonfiction area, who's written on a variety of historical topics of contemporary relevance. I just mentioned a couple of his books, The Angel of Amsterdam and My Father's Century. Gerd Mock is not just a writer, he's a journalist, he's a public intellectual. He has not stood on the sidelines over the last few years, as the Netherlands has been embroiled in a sometimes bitter debate about immigration and integration. And we all know that over the post-war period, the Netherlands was considered a model of tolerance and multiculturalism by many. Some see that status as now endangered, some are more optimistic. I think we can all agree that the issues we'll be discussing tonight are not particular to Dutch society, that we all are at a critical juncture, that the future is open, that our societies on both sides of the Atlantic face critical choices about how to deal with religious pluralism, religious and cultural pluralism in the contemporary era. So again, thank you all for coming, and thanks especially for Gerd Maak for coming here to Georgetown to share his ideas with us.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take you to Amsterdam this evening and to the broad, shimmering river Amstel, which flows slowly into the city. It is a wonderful place to go for a walk on a day like this, a sunny day, especially on the left bank between the bridges of the Herengracht and the Keizersgracht, past ships and the facades of the bourgeois palaces built by rich 17th century merchants. Take a good look, especially at the sandstone wall of number 216. Remember this number if you ever come in Amsterdam, 216. At first sight, it appears to be covered in graffiti. You think it is so difficult to get rid of this dreadful stuff. But look again. Those thin red lines are tags. They look like drawings of old ships with sails and flags. And look there, stars, Hebrew letters and Kabbalist symbols. And there, very faint, something that resembles a name, Van Buningen. And a few more letters that look like Jacoba. We are standing in front of the house with the bloodstains. That's what's been called since time immemorial. It used to be the residence of the rich merchant, major and leading diplomat Konrad van Beuningen. The inscriptions were almost certainly made by the owner himself during the last years of his insanity. It is 300-year-old graffiti, what you are seeing. The last desperate cries of a man seeing his world crumble around him. In the second half of the 17th century, Konrad van Beuningen was one of the most important figures in Dutch politics. He was 6 times Mayor of Amsterdam, Director of the Dutch East India Company, and Vice of the Republic in Stockholm and Paris. He was also the crisis manager of Stadtholder, that was a kind of king in these times, William III, in the crisis of the year 1672, when the country was attacked simultaneously by the French, the English, and the Bishop of Münster. Partly due to Van Beuningen's diplomatic skills, the Stadtholder managed to save the country. Shortly afterwards, however, Van Beuningen and the Stadtholder fell out and embittered Van Beuningen withdrew to his house on the river Amstel. Was this rude treatment the beginning of the European diplomat's downfall? We can only guess. Shortly after the affair, Van Beuningen fell under the spell of 2 somber preachers, and to make matters worse, the old man wanted to marry. His chosen one was a posh Amsterdam lady of dubious reputation, Jacoba Bartolotti van der Heuvel, who lived around the corner. She turned out to be a serpent, and his marriage brought him nothing but misery. He began speculating on the stock market, lost his money, began seeing visions of fire and coffins in the night sky above the butter market. That's now the Reverend Plein. His wife left him, and he ended up wandering around the cold, quiet houses of the Amstel River on winter nights, ranting and raving about the unspeakable lethargy of the Dutch bourgeoisie. He wrote his message on the facade of his house in his own blood. He died in poverty on the 26th of October 1693, leaving a cape and 2 dressing gowns, a bed, some chairs, a desk, an oval-shaped mirror, 4 old tabarets, and a man's portrait by Rembrandt, valued at 7 guilders, $3. We'll never know what demons drove Konrad van Beuningen: depression, Jacoba, heaven, hell, or other things. One thing is certain, however, one of them was politics, or, to be precise, the spiritual and moral state of his city and the Republic at the end of the 17th century. For no matter how hysteric his delusions seemed, the concerns he shouted over the Amstel in the quiet hours of the night were, in a sense, serious and real. His unique world had indeed gradually developed in a deep identity crisis. Part of this crisis was about citizenships. When times were good for him, Konrad van Beuningen had been the embodiment of the ideal Amsterdam merchant, a typical mercator sapiens, a wise merchant, the Renaissance model of the educated citizen familiar with classics while being able also to run a good business. After its relatively short period of prosperity, Van Beuningen saw the wayward Dutch culture of the Golden Age fall prey to lethargy and corruption. Another part of the crisis had deeper, more international roots. The northern Netherlands were unique in the 17th century. For decades, they had been a rich and peaceful kind of island in a turbulent Europe. They had an incredibly wide travel network and conducted politics like a large state, all on a quite small piece of land with relatively few inhabitants. Just as we in the rest of the world talk about the 11th of September, Van Beuningen and his contemporaries talked about the crisis year of 1672. By chance, the French invasion was stranded near Utrecht, and at an early stage, disagreement broke out among the attacking forces, and the young stadtholder William III proved to be a remarkably good strategist, saving the Netherlands, but only just. These events made it clear that the Republic's successful formula couldn't last. Its status was a burden the small country couldn't bear much longer. It was the worst crisis Van Beuningen had feared, the crisis of the end of the unique position of his country and town, the crisis of the uniqueness of his world. That was more than 300 years ago. We don't talk about bloodstains, Jacoba, or visions of covens above the butter market anymore in the Netherlands. Instead, we watch, for instance, a daily reality show in which 5 men and 5 women, including a mother and a father who left a couple of children behind, are locked up in a millionaire's villa where they can lead millionaire's lives for at least a year until they have made each other mad and only one remains. Jacoba has become a commodity. We read about the increasing fundamentalism of Muslim youth and hear from women friends who Muslim teens yell whore at them for cycling openly through town. We follow the public debate. 10 years ago, everything in the Netherlands was about tolerance, but nowadays people using the word are branded as multiculturalists or worse, traitors. We haven't had this much agreement, I think, since this year 1672. We are amazed about the statistics. In 1999, the percentage of Dutchmen who approved of the government and its politics was 65%. Since 2002, in 3 years, that's dropped to just 35%. Never before has the Social and Cultural Planning Office seen such a large change in such a short period of time. We deplore the disappearance of humor in the streets, the natural civil trust that used to bind us and which, at least in my city, seems to have been replaced by a kind of sad nostalgia for the Amsterdam of quiet canals and elm trees, of rattling trams too. A closed, private world which seems to have disappeared forever. And we have seemed to have forgotten that once there was a Mercator Sapiens, a wise merchant. The last 4 years have been insane in the Netherlands. That's for certain. It was like a drama. It was a kind of play. The only thing, I can talk for hours about that, but I have to do it short. I think the best thing is you have to imagine such a nice 19th century theater. And imagine here a small, strange show. It started with a bald, very, very homosexual politician, Pim Fortuyn. And everybody was amazed, he became the long-awaited leader of extreme right, conservative right, but also a Dutch kind of nationalist party. Not like Le Pen, not like Harder, its own Dutch kind. But he was murdered just days before his election victory by an animal activist, a very Calvinist animal activist, I must say. First act. Second act. Politics are totally in turmoil that whole summer. Government comes and goes and so on and so on. And then suddenly, you must imagine this theater, there comes down, rattling from the ceiling, a beautiful, beautiful and very charismatic African refugee, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And she starts talking about the problem in the same way like Fortuyn did, about the problems of immigrants, but also about the dangers of the Islam. And she had her own experience with that, and she was very convincing. She became very quick a star in the parliament. But he was threatened too, so she needed all the time protection. Together with a kind of Dutch Michael Moore. Theo van Gogh, of course, he was a little bit more right-wing than Michael Moore, even more provocative than Michael Moore. But still, she made a small movie about women who were beaten up and so on and so on. At the same time, there were texts of the Quran projected on half-naked bodies of this woman. It was meant to convince Muslim women, but most Muslims were only very offended, and it didn't work much. But it was enough to make one young Muslim very mad and angry. He was already mad and angry, but more in the middle of the day, he cut the throat of this Dutch Michael Moore, this poor Theo van Gogh, middle in the crowded Amsterdam street. You see the stage again, full of shouting and Dutch politics, and everybody in the newspaper was in uproar and insulting. It was also a kind of debate, but it was all very turbulent and difficult. You saw at the same time, you saw the mood of the rest of the country also changing, and that was reflected in the statistics. The opinion polls, for instance, last year showed that more than 40% of the Dutch wanted only someone of Dutch origin as a teacher for their children. More than 60% thought that Islam was incompatible with modern life in Europe. And a third openly admitted to having become more racist in recent years. So you saw really the mood changing in the country too, very quick, this tolerant country. Then the next act, a kind of entr'acte, you could say it. Like you see that often in these kind of theaters. That was suddenly very calm and sweet. That was I think it was almost not in the international press, but that were the local elections, those last March. It seemed that the same public suddenly thought, no, it is enough. Perhaps we went too far. The extreme right wing, the xenophobic parties lost totally. They lost almost lots of their influence in this local party. It was a big blow for them. But the bigger miracle was that this Turkish and Moroccan people, the majority, this Muslim, the majority went as real Dutch citizens to the voting box, solidly, really, en masse. And they didn't vote on special Islamic parties or something like that. No, in majority they voted just on normal, main-of-the-road Dutch parties, especially on this very dull and very Dutch social democratic party. It was a kind of miracle. But the show went on. Like in a real good B movie, there was an old friend, and a friend who became suddenly a crook. It happened this way. There was Minister Mrs. Verdonk. Mrs. Verdonk was Minister of Integration and Immigration. And this spring suddenly came out that Ayaan Hirsi, star in the parliament, and also spokeswoman for integration and immigration herself, had some problems with her own immigration. She had lied when she wanted to be a refugee. That, I must say honestly, a lot of people are doing. It's always difficult to forgive, but she had also not given her real name when she asked the Dutch nationality. And every lawyer can tell here that that is really, not for normal people, but for lawyers, is kind of dead sin. So this came out spring. She was, I must say honestly, rather open about it. But suddenly it became a political row, and I think you must imagine when you're a member of the House, which is very tough on immigration, and it comes out that she herself has also smuggled with quite a fact, then you are in political problems. So that happened. But this Minister of Integration was always a friend of Ayaan Hirsi, thought, now I have to be tough. Elections are coming, and she stabbed the knife in the back of Hirsi. So she said, you are not Dutch citizen anymore. Again, enormous role on this stage. Parliament, nights, there was discussions for night long, and at the end, the government went away, was dissolved, and Ayaan Hirsi kept her Dutch nationality, but started to live here in the United States. Something, I must say honestly, she had in mind already a long time. Last act. Now we are in the middle of these elections. And now very strange is happening. What are these elections are about? About integration problems, about immigrants, terrorism, refugees, modernism and Islam? Not at all. Almost all discussions, only the extreme right parties are still talking a little bit about it, but almost all discussions are just about pensions, childcare, spending power trends. Nothing about the things the Dutch have shouted to each other for 4 years. Suddenly, it is quiet again. Dutch clouds float by as if nothing has happened. That may be the craziest thing of all about these last 4 years of national history in 5 minutes. In the middle of the Yugoslavian war, I visited the old writer Alexander Tisma in Bonn, Novi Sad. I used to him the word tragedy for everything that had happened to his own town and his country. But he said very quickly, no, these are not the ingredients for a tragedy, but, sir, for a comedy, for a farce. I have often thought of him these last few years. How serious do we need to be about this Dutch disease? Is the Netherlands a European model as far as this is concerned? Is there any reason to shout over the Amstel again, to yell about the unspeakable lethargy of the Dutch, and as some do here, about Europe's weakness in the face of the rapid spread of Islam? In the autumn of 2003, when all Sweden was shaken by the murder of Minister of Foreign Affairs Anna Lindh, columnist Goran Rosenberg wrote a short essay which I read nodding in agreement 700 miles down the road in Amsterdam. Our country is still mesmerized by its own success story, he wrote. The history of one of the poorest nations in Europe, which developed in a world model of affluence and social care. Had the Swedes rudely awakened from their innocence, as many foreign newspapers suggested? No, Rosenberg wrote, Sweden hadn't had innocence to awake from for a long time. There had been nothing innocent about the percentage of murders, violent crime, shootings, drug violence and gang rapes for years. What the Swedes had to wake up from wasn't innocence, but self-delusion. He wrote bitterly, a delusion combining their fear of Europe and the rest of the world and the nostalgia for a Sweden which had ceased to exist a long time ago. Rosenberg could have been writing about Denmark or about the Netherlands. An important part of our misleading self-image is the fiction that Dutch society is more or less static, and that the integration of newcomers may be compared to adding a few new colors and flavors to a containing of calmly maturing yogurt. If it mixes well, and the yogurt continues to taste as yogurt, all is well, all is well. Or so the people seem to think. If things work out differently, there is a problem. Nothing could be further from reality. We, Dutchmen of native Dutch ancestry, lie to ourselves when we say that we don't change. That's only outsiders who force us to. I recently spoke to a filmmaker making a movie about Amsterdam in 1979. He was desperately seeking locations, but was having difficulty finding them. A costume drama set in the 18th century, he said to me, is easier to produce these days than a film set in the Amsterdam of barely a quarter of a century ago. Nothing had remained the same. It is more realistic, therefore, to visualize Dutch society as a speeding train which newcomers, youth, immigrants need to jump on. And which, what's more, it is a train from the magical world of Harry Potter. A train which, while moving, continually changes both spiritually and physically. Just like the Swedes, we, citizens of the Netherlands, need to go through a number of painful and complicated transition periods through situations which can create great turbulence themselves and which, when combined, could indeed lead to the political and moral perfect storm which has been raging recently. I will name three. They are partly typically Dutch and partly exist in all of Western Europe. First of all, a typically Dutch situation. The fundamental political and religious transition the country is going through, a transition which is much more far-reaching than that in the so-called famous 60s. I use the combination politics, religion on purpose, because the Netherlands was formerly intensely religious, and because of the social-political pillar system it had, political contradictions largely coincide with religious or ideological divides. Not just politics, but social life was divided in this way too. In the small provincial town I grew up, I went, for instance, to a Protestant school, a Reformed school. But the newspaper, the university where my brother studied, the football club, the scouts, the baker, and the milkman were Protestant, even Reformed too. Even the leaves on the trees were, I sometimes thought. The work of my uncle, who was a socialist and worked as a teacher at the local school, looked the same. Only he bought his bread at a socialist co-op. And I think the leaves on the trees looked a little different to him too. Yet there was no problem ruling the country. The elites at the top of the pillars made continual compromises with each other. Such was a tradition of what is called the polder model. The system as a whole functioned as a very effective pacification machine in this religiously divided country, and at the same time created a national community which seemed much more tolerant than it really was, because people simply looked away from each other. The system came to an end when the Dutch began to leave the church in droves. In 1958, 1/4 of the Dutch claimed to be churchless. In 2020, this will be 3/4. With that, the whole foundation of the political and partly of the social system disappeared. Since the 70s, many of the old political parties have been abolished or merged, but only now are the consequences of secularization having an impact on the political culture itself. The Dutch politicians need to find new bases for their politics. People like Pim Fortuyn were especially angry about the fact that Muslims reintroduced the concept of religion into Dutch politics because, as Jan Burema writes in his very interesting book about the situation in the Netherlands, they had just painfully wrested themselves free from the strictures of their own religions. My own experience confirms this. Contrary to what you would expect, many Orthodox Christians in the Netherlands supported the Muslims in this crisis. They recognized their problems, and together they worried about a kind of rapidly spreading enlightened fundamentalism. Or, as the editor of an Orthodox daily once said to me, today the Minister for Integration, the same Mrs. Verdonk, provokes an incident with an Orthodox Muslim because she refuses to shake the hand, the Muslim refuses to shake the hand of a woman, but next year she'll ignore me wanting to say grace before lunch. In other words, it wasn't just a clash between the values of the West and those of the Islam, but also one between secularism and religion in general. Letting go of the religious and ideological order, therefore, meant an end to the traditional political truce in the Netherlands. The breakdown of the pillar system created enough space for a phenomenon which has existed in other European countries for much longer. The National Populist Party, which managed to gain the support of the angry part of the electorate, which doesn't usually vote. Pim Fortuyn, its leader, was the first to manage this. His supporters are doing well electorally nowadays, but such an attack on the elite will no doubt repeat itself. Because that too is an aspect of these transitions. The pillars may have resolved, but their elites and their successors are still in power. Power, however, which is no longer solidly rooted. The brakes are off. The second fundamental transition concerns urbanization. Amsterdam and Rotterdam, I can't stress this enough, are only a small part of the Netherlands. In Konrad van Beuningen's time, the Netherlands consisted of only one large European city, Amsterdam, and dozens of small and medium-sized provincial towns. The city attracted all the attention, but the heart and mind of the land were located in the provinces, and until recently that was still the case. Bourgeois, a little xenophobic, but yet free-thinking, conservative, but no offensive. That was and is the mood of the bourgeoisie in these provincial towns. The real Netherlands was for centuries Zutphen, Leeuwarden and Roermond. Those were the towns, after all, which provided the decisive election results. But all this is changing. Both the media and politics are increasingly dominated by the cities of Amsterdam, Utrecht, Rotterdam and Den Haag, which form an urban ring called the so-called Randstad. This entire ring is in the process of turning into one large delta metropolis, something like the Bay Area, bound built around a large piece of protected old polderland, which in the future may serve as a kind of giant central park. Soon, more than half of the Dutch population will live in this metropolis. After London, Paris and the rural area, the largest urban agglomeration in northwestern Europe. As a result, the relatively provincial Netherlands is rapidly opening up to the rest of the world. I remember that after the bomb attacks on the London Underground last year, the British newspapers published series of short biographies of the victims. They were often moving accounts of the short lives of office clerks, students, IT specialists, nurses, mostly promising young people from all corners of the world. Unintentionally, these pages showed also something else. This is what a train carriage in a European metropolis looks like in the morning rush hour. And it is true, the dynamics and culture which these young people exude stand for everything that fundamentalists hate. Robert Kaplan talks about the appearance of a world network of metroplexes, major urban conglomerates dominated by large waves of immigration and top technology, which don't really need national mediators anymore. They are becoming cosmopolitan cities in the most literal sense of the word. Dutch Randstad is in the middle of this process. At the moment, a quarter of the population of the central and southern part of Amsterdam consists of expats, immigrants from highly industrialized countries. The main language at my bakery changed from year to year. My neighborhood, my city, needs to find itself in this, in new forms, in a new language, in a new type of citizenship. Finally, there is the immigrant, symbol and scapegoat of all worries and frustrations which the previously mentioned changes have caused, yet an influential phenomenon in itself, in the big cities at least. First, a few facts. At the moment, there are about 16 million Muslim immigrants living in Europe. Added to these are the 7 million Muslims who have lived in communities in Bosnia and Albania for centuries. Together, that's about 23 million to a total of 460 million Europeans. So when people are telling Europe is engulfed by Muslims, it can be true, but we are engulfed by about 0.5% of our populations. As a result, in large parts of Europe, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, but also almost everywhere on the countryside, there are hardly any or no Muslim immigrants. As far as my own country is concerned, officially there are about 1 million Muslims living in the Netherlands who make up about 6% of the total population. But it is different in some cities, especially in the big cities, and in some neighborhoods. For instance, a provincial town as Amersfoort, there is almost a quarter of the inhabitants now from Moroccan or Turkish descent. And let's, for instance, zoom in on my own city, Amsterdam. In a year or two, 3, the original Dutch will be there, a minority even. Does that mean that the city is being taken over by Muslims, and that, for instance, the concert hall, a temple, a concertgebouw, a temple of Western music, will have to be closed, as former European Commissioner Frits Bolkestein claims sometimes? Look again at the figures. Of the more than 700,000 Amsterdammers, not even 120,000 are from Muslim countries, Turkey and Morocco in particular. The majority of immigrants, more than 250,000, is from elsewhere, from Suriname, from Indonesia, from Antilles, and don't forget Germany, England, Japan, the rest of Europe, the USA. It is true that Amsterdam is fast de-Dutchifying, you can say. However, we are not seeing the emergence of a Muslim city, but of a but of a cosmopolitan metroplex as described by Robert Kepler. And that is essentially something else. We are going in the direction of London. Another question is, do these Muslim minorities, which are rather big, manage to integrate into that modern urban system? Some Dutch authors speak of a multicultural disaster. That when American city sociologists like John Mollenkopf and Julius Wilson visited the Netherlands, they bursted out laughing. What? These are your ghettos? What a lucky country. Who is right? I would like to start with the word multiculturality. You can be positive or negative about it, but the time of dreamy theories is long gone. The Netherlands as a whole, indeed, will not become multicultural for years, for centuries. But large parts of Amsterdam and Rotterdam and Utrecht and Den Haag and Amersfoort have been that already for years. What's more, if you talk to pupils there, students, partygoers, people in their late 20s or early 30s, you will find that no one talks about multiculturality anymore. For them, it's not a utopia, but it is no disaster either. It is a natural fact they have been living in this all their lives. Figures from the Amsterdam Social Cultural Studies Bureau show that, with regard to the age at which people marry and have children, the younger generations of Muslim immigrants increasingly resemble the Dutch. The fall in the number of children is spectacular, from more than 8 in the first generation to less than 4 in the second. The average level of education has improved enormously compared to the widespread illiteracy of 20 years ago, and is similar to that of Dutch people from similar income groups. The social maps of the richer suburbs increasingly show, that's very interesting, how small pockets of Turks, the suburbs increasingly show that you see everywhere in these rich neighborhoods small pockets of Turks coming up, a sign that this group is joining the richer middle classes. In other words, at various levels, the integration of Muslims, immigrants in the Amsterdam area and also in other areas of the country is not so bad. But I must say, in other parts of the country, things are going worse and slowly, especially in Rotterdam and Den Haag, cities which are much poorer, have cheaper and poorer quality housing, and have the most problem areas. In general, you can say that about 80% in all surveys come on the same balance, about 75, 80% of the immigrants from Morocco and Turkey are doing rather well or good, 20% is problematic. There is only one aspect in which the Netherlands in general differs from all other modern immigration areas. The Americans grinned when they saw our ghettos, but they did notice something else. The rate of integration in terms of work, language and education went astonishingly slowly. So it went, you don't need to be desperate, but it was very slow. In 1998, John Mollenkopf, professor of sociology and director of the Center for Urban Research of the City University of New York, conducted an extensive study into the differences between Amsterdam and New York. His conclusions were eye-opening. The average immigrant in New York has a better job and a higher social position in a shorter period of time than the one in Amsterdam. After 10 years, the children of New York immigrants do better at school and university than the Amsterdam ones do after 25. The figures of criminality among some groups of young immigrants are strikingly high in the Netherlands, and there is little contact between newcomers and those who have been living in the country for a while. I think, again, the situation has improved the last years, but still, how can we explain these differences? Also the differences differences between the Netherlands and other European countries. Why things are going so slowly? Joe Mollenkopf suggests that the good social facilities in the Netherlands have unintentionally played an important part in the slow integration of this group. Work is still the best way of integration fast. In the Netherlands, however, people are not pushed to the limit to take part in the process of employment. In other words, there are too many opportunities in the Netherlands to avoid work and integration. The social services, you could say, are too good. Another cause of differences is, no doubt, the nature of this modern wave of immigration. During the golden years of Koenraad van Beuningen, there were also large groups of immigrants who came to settle in the city of Amsterdam. 17th century Amsterdam was a kind of an American melting pot. So strong that even the language changed. Within 2 generations, the people in Amsterdam changed from a kind of North Dutch dialect to the Antwerp language. So intense was this immigration in that time. Things are different today. The Turkish and Moroccan immigrants who arrived in the 60s or 70s of the 20th century came largely from small, poor, traditional villages in Anatolia and the Rift Mountains. They couldn't read or write, they didn't speak a foreign language, and they were invited only to fill up some gaps in the labor market. Neither the immigrants themselves nor the Dutch government intended them to migrate permanently. They weren't suitable for that. The difference between their closed tribal village life and the postmodern urban society of the Netherlands was much too great. The problem, therefore, was not so much one of Turkey and Morocco versus the Netherlands or Islam versus the West, but one of the enormous gap between countryside and city, a problem which, by the way, exists in all rapidly modernizing societies. The situation was worsened by the fact that the Netherlands, as opposed to a classic country of immigration like the United States, had and has almost no rituals to welcome immigrants and give them their own space. What's more, both parties, newcomers and established inhabitants alike, have endlessly postponed the real psychological immigration and integration. I once asked a few students of Turkish descent when their parents had decided to stay in the Netherlands for good. As they were born and bred in the Netherlands, I expected the decision to have taken in the early 90s. But no, they talked about 4 or 5 years ago, about 2000, 2001. For at least a quarter of a century, these families had lived with the meat of the delayed departure, with the illusion that all will be temporary. But the immigrants and the Dutch had their own motive, both the immigrants and the Dutch had their own motives for this, because neither party wanted this immigration. Only insiders, neighbors, the police, social workers, some journalists knew that there was a time bomb ticking away. Now, what is the relationship between these problems and the Islam? Like I said before, there are politicians and panel members who believe that most of these problems are based on religious matters. Islam and modernity are not compatible. With all due respect, I dispute this. Look only again to the figures. Did we ever have serious integration problems in Amsterdam, for instance, with the thousands of Muslims from Istanbul or Sarajevo, or again with the thousands from Indonesia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and Egypt? Certainly, Islam is struggling as a religion to find a new place in modern times, and Europe has unintentionally become a front line in that struggle. In that sense, there are religious and cultural contradictions and clashes involved, particularly focusing on the relationship between man and woman. There were and will be very necessary debates about Western values and the values of the Islam. Debates also about secularism and religion, and about the enlightenment of the Sharia. And above all, about the question, which are universal values and which are values belonging to our different cultures. It is a deep, far-going debate within almost all Western European communities. And it is going on at this moment. What are exactly our common values, and which of our values are so universal that we have to impose them on all citizens, immigrants and non-immigrants, religious or non-religious? To abstain from physical violence in political and religious debates, for sure. To guarantee freedom of opinion, yes. To guarantee the same basic rights for every human being, man or woman, of course. But is, for instance, the tradition of the Enlightenment the one and only universal heritage of the West European societies? Are there no Christian values, no humanistic values, no interesting other values in our Dutch and European heritage? In my city, and in a lot of other European cities, this interesting debate is not only a theoretical issue. When you proclaim only the values of the Enlightenment as universal, it has far-reaching consequences in practical life. You want that Muslims have to convert to some kind of enlightened secularism, and if they don't, which you can expect, they are excluded from the modern world and integration into Western society. That's the consequence of this theory. In a city like mine, that means that about 1/6 of the population is excluded and written off. They will never feel themselves at home. Integration, forget it. And beside that, isn't it also a fundamental right to find out your own way of life, your own destiny, and even to find out your own religious way of life? Indeed, we have to accept the Islam as one of the European religions. That doesn't mean that we can close our eyes for the problems and difficulties around some clashes of cultures. Sometimes we have even to stand up and fight. But we have to think over and redefine our own attitudes too, if you like it or not. And when you do that, you discover a Dutch, sometimes a European, but in this case I talk about Holland, a Dutch society which is more contradictory and complicated than you would expect on first view. Every nation is essentially an imaginative society. You know what anthropologist Benedict Anderson has written about it. For decades, our Dutch imaginative society was based, of course, on the history of the war. Perhaps we can, after the break, we can talk about that. It was very anti-racist, but it was also based on concepts like civil solidarity, tolerance, and openness. With those, after all, we had become a rich and happy country. With the arrival of more and more immigrants, with the opening to the world, however, it became increasingly at odds with our own principles. The principle of solidarity, for instance, gave us the warmth of a welfare state. But if we would then, on the basis that same principle, share our wealth with newcomers from elsewhere, it would mean the end of the same welfare state. The openness, another characteristic of this trading nation by the sea, became threatened by a new fundamentalism which has entered our country as a result of the same openness. And similarly, our tolerance, like former Amsterdam Mayor Ed van Tijn predicted years ago, could kill tolerance too. These were and are difficult dilemmas. But for years they could be avoided just by making the word immigrant taboo. Although they know better, government officials and the media kept using terms referring to temporary immigration and terms like, I used only terms like migrant worker, foreign born, and asylum seeker. The immigrant is an ordinary name. Immigration is an unavoidable and even necessary phenomenon. It demands that every normal society put on immigrants the open conflict that comes with it, like it happens here in the United States. This whole process, it was not to be in Holland. The debate about immigration and integration tells so a lot about Dutch society, about hope and faith in ourselves and in each other, but also about the opposite, about a moral panic among some of the Dutch. One of the historical patterns we have to get used to again is that things can get worse, can become less, that achievements may disappear, that such loss is not temporary but permanent. So part of the Dutch civil crisis is simply about mourning, about loss. We mourn, for instance, a lost sense of security. We mourn the disappearance of the ties based on common religious, political and nationalist feelings, the sense of identity that came with it, and which is disappearing or has already disappeared in Europe and in the world. But there is a limit to all this mourning, because our national identity, that of an open country in northwestern Europe, just can't be put under a kind of protective glass cheese cover. It wouldn't work. Other things are more important, and we have it at home too. Self-confidence, citizenship, individualism, the will to accept the facts and to be part of our new country, and part also of our new Europe. This is also where people try and retain, for example, the principles of the whole European tradition. Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, Humanism, Enlightenment, Romantism, this entire rational, free, and at the same time humane and spiritual way of thinking. They are trying to hold on to the constitutional state and democracy, values that are threatened to degenerate into formalities. They develop a new kind of tolerance, more realistic, more respectful, with a real look in each other's eyes. And they are holding on to good education, which should pass that common cultural heritage to the next generations, immigrants and non-immigrants, again, like it happens here, I hope, in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, I spoke with my former colleague, Paolo de Mas, recently. Working for the University of Amsterdam, he has spent years following a group of immigrants from a small area in Morocco. His observations confirm the picture I have been painting this last hour. His families have indeed integrating better in Spanish, French, German and Belgian cities than in the Dutch cities. He said, if these groups had moved into the Netherlands in the early 50s, it's likely there would have been very few problems. They would have easily found a place in the pillar system that existed in that time. Everything was still clean. Everyone went to his own church on Sundays. Roads were clearly defined. If you drove through a red light, you got a ticket. If you didn't pay attention at school, you got a slap. It was a recognizable society for everyone, also for Moroccans from a small village. Compared to the rest of the world, the Netherlands became exotic after the 60s. Became exotic after the 60s. Paolo de Mas had good news too. He also said, I was lying on a Moroccan beach recently, and I could immediately identify the holidaying Dutch Moroccans. That's how much they have integrated by now. I asked, how did you know? He said, very simple, from the kids, from the children's behavior. What I meant to say is, underneath all that turbulence that's still going on in Holland, the country is an old, solid, stable, civil society. So strong, in fact, that despite despite lacking the will to immigrate and the lack of immigration politics, despite the sometimes enormous cultural and religious differences, despite the discrimination of recent years, it has managed to convince and hold on to the majority of immigrants and immigrant youth. Because that's what you hear too little about all those teachers, lecturers, neighborhood councillors, local policemen, social workers, housewives, and all those immigrants and non-immigrants with courage, a sense of responsibility, and endless patience, who are indeed keeping their heads cool and our cities and our country together. That's the great fundamental power of these times. The Netherlands is changing a lot, but it is not disappearing, even if Konrad van Beuningen loses sometimes his mind. Thank you very much.